Chapter 1: The Rise of the Plantation Mistress, Georgia, 1847. The sky above is heavy, thick with the scent of freshly tilled earth, and the sun casts long shadows over a sprawling plantation. Cotton fields stretch as far as the eye can see, and the distant sound of workers in the fields echoes through the humid air. But beyond this vast, fertile land, behind the grand pillars of a southern plantation house, lies a story that's rarely told, a story buried beneath layers of history, obscured by the mist of time, a story of power, control, and the sinister legacy of one woman, Margaret Rowe. She was known as Madame Rowe, a name that brought both reverence and fear among those who lived in her shadow. A woman of immense beauty and wealth, yet beneath her poised exterior lay a mind as cold and calculating as the iron chains that bound the souls of the enslaved. Margaret wasn't just a woman who managed a plantation. No, she was the architect of her family's empire, an empire that was built on a foundation of sweat, blood, and broken spirits. In the world of the southern plantation, women like Margaret Rowe wielded influence in ways that were often overlooked. Their power wasn't just found in their homes, in the elegant parlors where they hosted guests, or in the fine silks they wore. No, their power was felt in the fields, in the lives of the people they controlled, and in the fortunes they amassed. For Margaret, her wealth wasn't simply the result of business savvy or inheritance. It was forged in the relentless labor of the enslaved. And yet, Margaret's legacy wasn't just built on the backs of the enslaved, it was a legacy of power that would stretch beyond her life. For her, slavery was a business, and like all businesses, it required more than just the labor of others. It required control of everything, the land, the people, and most terrifying of all, their very lives. The mistress in the business of slavery, while her husband, the plantation owner, was often absent, preoccupied with managing the financial side of things, Margaret remained at the helm of this operation. She understood that a plantation wasn't just about harvesting crops. It was about owning people, about possessing them in ways that few could comprehend. Slavery, to Margaret, was not just a moral failing, it was an asset. It was the key to her success. Each slave she acquired wasn't just another worker. They were property. They were investment stools to build her empire. But Margaret didn't merely purchase people. She carefully selected them, watched them, and kept track of their worth. Every pregnancy, every birth, every life measured, monitored, and then bought and sold. It was a system, a business, and Margaret was its ruthless CEO. The darker ambitions of Margaret Rowe, but there was something more to Margaret's ambition, something darker. For Margaret, the plantation wasn't just a means to secure wealth, it was a way to guarantee a legacy. She understood something that many of her peers didn't. She understood that wealth, in the South, wasn't just about land or crops. It was about the people you controlled and, more specifically, the people you could breed. Margaret wasn't content to simply run a plantation. She wasn't satisfied with just the cotton harvest or the profits from her slaves. No. Margaret Rowe knew that in order to truly secure her family's wealth, she needed more than just workers. She needed to create new ones. The breeding grounds in the twisted logic of the plantation economy. Children weren't just the product of love or fate, they were investments. And Margaret, alongside her sons, would ensure that every enslaved woman on her land could bear children. Children who would grow up to serve her family. Children who would add to her wealth, and to the growing horror of what was happening in the fields of Georgia, Margaret's sons would follow in her footsteps. Their education steeped in the business of breeding slaves, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation would continue. They would inherit her power, and with it, the moral decay that would mark their legacy. And so, the practice continued, dark and hidden from the world outside. The blood of enslaved women spilled to create more slaves for the Rowe family. The legacy of power and guilt. Margaret Rowe's legacy would be one of unimaginable wealth, but also one of profound guilt. She had built her empire on bloodshed, on the broken bodies of those who had no voice, no agency. And as the years passed, her family would continue the cycle, feeding off the suffering they had inflicted. But Margaret's fate was sealed. The empire she built would eventually crumble under the weight of its own sins. The plantation mistress who once ruled with an iron fist, the woman who turned human lives into commodities, was now a forgotten figure, her legacy lost to time. But the horrors of her actions, the lives she destroyed, would never truly be forgotten. Her story, though largely erased, would echo through the generations, a reminder of the price of wealth built on the backs of others. And as the world moved on, the ghosts of the Rowe plantation would continue to haunt the land. Chapter 2: The Family Legacy and Its Dark Ties. Margaret Rowe's sons grew up in the shadow of a woman whose will was unyielding, whose presence commanded the land they walked upon. From a young age, they were taught that their birthright wasn't a gift, it was an inheritance of power. They would come to understand that every decision they made, every step they took, would be weighed against the immense fortune their family had built. But there was one lesson Margaret instilled in them above all else. The plantation was their kingdom, and they were destined to be its rulers. From the time they were children, Margaret's sons were exposed to a life that would have shaped anyone's view of the world. The plantation house was more than just a home, it was a fortress. Its walls bore witness to decades of cruelty, injustice, and cold, calculated decisions. It was here that the seeds of a dark legacy were planted, and it was here that Margaret would mold her sons into the men who would carry her vision forward. The older son, Thomas Rowe, was the more calculated of the two. From the very beginning, Thomas showed a keen mind for business. He was meticulous, often found poring over ledgers, studying the patterns of trade and labor, and understanding the complex mechanics of the plantation economy. He was the kind of man who believed that wealth could be built upon efficiency, that every moment spent was an opportunity to increase the family fortune. He understood the value of a good crop and a good slave. For Thomas, the plantation was a well-oiled machine. The cotton fields were his empire, and every worker on those fields, regardless of whether they were enslaved or free, was part of the equation. He treated the system like a business, and in many ways, that's exactly what it was, a dark, insidious business. Thomas' job was to make sure that business continued to thrive, to ensure that every piece of the operation functioned as it was supposed to. But while he could manage the finances and deal with the external aspects of plantation life, it was the darker, more personal side of the business that his brother William would come to control. William Rowe, the younger son, was different. From an early age, he exhibited a temperament that marked him as someone with far less restraint than his older brother. While Thomas focused on the external workings of the plantation, William was concerned with something more intimate: the people who lived on it. William wasn't simply interested in controlling the enslaved people through economics and management. He had a darker fascination with them. His power wasn't just in overseeing them, it was in possessing them. He often visited the slave quarters, engaging with the people in a manner that was troubling and unsettling. While many plantation owners maintained a respectful distance from their enslaved workforce, William sought to assert his control over them in ways that were far more invasive. For Margaret, William's behavior was both troubling and intriguing. She saw something in him, an undeniable hunger for power, a drive that she had always understood but had kept hidden from the world. He was her son, after all, and in many ways, she had shaped his path. She recognized the same coldness in him that she had seen in herself. But while Margaret had always kept her ambitions subtle, masked by the social niceties of her time, William was openly consumed by his desire to dominate. She knew he was destined to carry on her legacy in a way that no one could predict. At first, it was small things: his insistence on choosing which enslaved people would be bred, which would be sold, and which would remain under his personal control. Margaret watched these developments with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew her sons had the power to shape their family's future, but she also saw the dangerous path that William was beginning to tread. It was a path of unchecked power, of ruthlessness, and it was a path that could very well lead them all to ruin. As the years went on, Thomas continued to manage the economic side of the plantation, ensuring that it remained profitable and that their wealth continued to grow. He focused on making wise business decisions, carefully negotiating sales and purchases of land, slaves, and goods. But his mind never strayed far from the business of human lives. He knew that the key to long-term success lay not only in the cultivation of crops but in the breeding of enslaved people. He and his brother had inherited the family business, and it was a business that depended on the suffering of others. Thomas's business dealings were always calculated. He understood the value of maintaining a balance between supply and demand, between the acquisition of more land and the purchase of more enslaved people. His cold, methodical approach made him an excellent businessman, but it also made him deeply detached from the human cost of his decisions. He rarely interacted with the enslaved people on the estate, choosing instead to maintain his distance, always hiding behind the numbers, the ledgers, and the legal transactions that masked the true brutality of his actions. William, however, took a different approach. He became obsessed with the lives of the people who lived on his plantation. He watched them closely, learned their habits, and studied their weaknesses. His relationship with the enslaved women was particularly unsettling. While Margaret had always understood the importance of breeding, she had never been as personally involved in it as William became. He would select women who were strong, healthy, and of childbearing age. He would watch over them, ensuring that they were treated in such a way that their bodies would yield new slaves to increase the family's wealth. But William's involvement went beyond business. He saw the enslaved people as his property in ways that no one had before. He began to see them as not only objects for labor but as his personal possessions, to be manipulated and controlled at his will. His cruelty grew over time, and rumors of his actions began to spread. The people who worked for him, the women he preyed upon, began to speak in whispers. They talked of his behavior, his need to control every aspect of their lives, to bend them to his will, and to take from them whatever he desired. Despite his dark inclinations, William was clever. He knew how to mask his actions, how to present himself as a respectable gentleman, a man of class and power. He played the role of the wealthy plantation heir to perfection, but beneath that mask was a man who saw the enslaved people as little more than objects to be used and discarded at his convenience. He grew more isolated from the rest of society, convinced that he was above reproach. His power had become intoxicating, and with each new acquisition, each new act of domination, his obsession with control only deepened. Meanwhile, Thomas continued to build the family's wealth in a more traditional sense. He worked tirelessly to maintain the plantation's profitability, ensuring that it remained a well-oiled machine. He married into other prominent families, further solidifying his position in Southern society. He would often talk about expanding the estate, about increasing production and securing more slaves to work the land. But his vision of the future was cold and impersonal. It was a future where everything was accounted for except the people. Together, the two brothers created a powerful and unbreakable bond, though it was rooted in a shared darkness. Thomas managed the business, while William took care of the more personal aspects of the plantation's operation. Their combined efforts ensured that the Rowe family's wealth grew exponentially. But in their pursuit of wealth, they began to lose sight of the true cost of their actions. The suffering of the enslaved people, the lives they had destroyed, became nothing more than a footnote in their ever-expanding empire. Chapter 3. The Cracks in the Rowe Legacy. Georgia, 1851. The air on the Rowe plantation was thick with heat and silence, the kind of silence that pressed down harder than the summer sun. The fields stretched farther than ever before, cotton white and endless, broken only by the figures that bent and toiled beneath it. The Rowe name was now carved into the very earth of Georgia, etched into ledgers, whispered in parlors, and cursed in the quarters. Margaret Rowe's empire had grown larger than she had ever dared to dream. Yet the larger the empire became, the more fragile it seemed. The Rowe sons had taken the reins of their inheritance, shaping it in their own likeness. To outsiders, they appeared as the twin pillars of Southern prosperity. Thomas, cold and meticulous; William, proud and magnetic. But beneath that surface, the differences between them deepened with each passing year. The plantation that had once been Margaret's singular dominion now reflected the conflicting visions of her heirs, and the cracks in their legacy had begun to show. The expanding empire. Thomas Rowe had built himself into a man of numbers. He rarely looked out across the fields. Instead, he sat at his desk with ink-stained fingers, his face lit by lamplight as he pored over columns of figures. To him, the plantation was not land or people, but equations, yields, profits, projections. Each berth in the quarters was marked with the same precision as each bale of cotton. He could recite from memory the number of hands fit for the fields, the number of children old enough to carry water, the number of mouths that required feeding. It was Thomas who had turned his mother's practices into systems, his ledgers a grim testament to efficiency. He negotiated with traders and merchants, always with a calmness that unsettled his peers. While others drank deep at gatherings, Thomas spoke little, listened much, and calculated constantly. The Rowe Empire's steady rise bore his fingerprints. William, on the other hand, sought not to count the plantation but to rule it. Where Thomas hid behind his ledgers, William walked the grounds with a restless energy. He lingered in the quarters, strode through the fields, and inspected the enslaved with eyes that missed nothing. He spoke less of numbers and more of obedience. His vision of the plantation was one of dominion, not efficiency but power, raw and unchallenged. To him, the enslaved were not tallies on a page. They were property that bent to his will. To the enslaved, Thomas was a distant figure, cold but predictable. William was something else entirely, a man whose presence tightened the air, whose gaze made the strongest among them avert their eyes. His power was immediate, intimate, and suffocating. Margaret's decline. Margaret Rowe still sat at the head of the household, but her body was betraying her. Age had bent her frame, yet her mind remained sharp as the blade of a knife. She watched her sons with the vigilance of a hawk, her iron will refusing to fade even as her strength waned. She approved of Thomas's precision, though she feared his detachment. He saw wealth but not power, numbers but not control. He was her pride and yet her frustration. William, however, was both her mirror and her curse. He carried her hunger for domination, but he wielded it recklessly, without the restraint she had once mastered. On long evenings, Margaret summoned them both to her parlor. Thomas would arrive with ledgers under his arm, William with a restless impatience. She would lecture them on the fragility of empires, on the importance of control not merely of land or crops, but of perception. Our name, she would remind them, is built on more than wealth. It is built on fear, on reverence. That is what must endure. But even as she spoke, she sensed their divergence. Thomas's eyes lingered on the pages before him. William's gaze wandered to the window, to the dark fields beyond. Whispers in the quarters while the rows schemed. The enslaved whispered. By firelight in the quarters, stories passed from one tongue to another. They spoke of Margaret's iron rule, of Thomas's ledgers, of William's suffocating presence. They sang songs that sounded like laments to an overseer's ear, but carried hidden meanings among themselves. The young learned old codes, and the elders guarded secrets that could not be written down. Every broken tool, every ruined patch of cotton was part of a quiet resistance. Each act was small on its own, but together they formed a language of defiance. Mothers taught their children to remember not just the pain, but the ways to endure. Fathers spoke of escape in words veiled with caution. And always the name Roe was spoken with a bitterness that time could not dull. The larger the enslaved population grew, the stronger the whispers became. The Roe Empire had expanded on the backs of these men and women, but with that expansion came a danger Margaret had long feared. A people multiplied could one day rise. The brothers' divides the years wore on. The differences between Thomas and William sharpened into open conflict. At first, their disagreements were confined to the parlor, Thomas insisting on caution in purchases, William demanding more control over lives, but soon their arguments spilled into the fields. Thomas would scold William for disrupting the work with his constant presence among the enslaved. Fear is useful, Thomas told him once, his voice low but firm, but fear alone does not build an empire, it breaks it. William sneered at his brother's restraint. Numbers do not bend a man's back in the sun. Numbers do not silence whispers. Obedience is not written in ink. Their quarrels grew louder, and Margaret, sitting in her chair like a queen on her throne, listened with narrowed eyes. She had wanted unity between her sons, but now she saw rivalry taking root. Rivalry was dangerous. Rivalry invited weakness. The gathering storm beyond the plantation, the world itself was shifting. The North grew louder in its condemnation of slavery, and though Georgia still clung fiercely to its institution, the Roes could feel the tremors of change. Traders spoke of unrest in other counties. Newspapers carried stories of runaways and uprisings. Closer to home, whispers of William's excesses reached beyond the plantation gates. Neighbors muttered at church gatherings. Rivals in business smirked at the rumors, eager for a chink in the Roe armor. Margaret dismissed these whispers as envy, but she knew well how quickly envy could become action. And within the quarters, the enslaved waited. They bent under the sun, they obeyed when commanded, but they did not forget. They watched the cracks in the Roe family widen, and in those cracks, they saw possibility. The Roe plantation in 1851 stood at the height of its wealth, its fields overflowing, its name respected and feared. But beneath the white columns of the great house and the endless rows of cotton, the empire Margaret Roe had built rested on a fault line. And as with all things built on cruelty, the question was not if it would break, but when. Chapter 4. The House Divided Georgia. 1854. The Roe plantation had never been larger, never more prosperous, never more feared. Its fields rolled across the landscape like an ocean of white, the cotton stretching to the horizon in every direction. The wealth that poured into the Roe coffers had made them one of the most powerful families in the county, if not the entire state. Yet beneath the grand facade of columns and polished wood, beneath the silks and silver of the great house, the Roe family was unraveling. For Margaret Roe, age was proving a merciless master. She sat now more often in her parlor than on the veranda, her body bent by the years, though her mind remained sharp as ever. The firelight illuminated the furrows in her face, but her eyes, those cold, commanding eyes, still burned with the same intensity as when she had first taken the reins of the plantation decades earlier. She had built an empire out of blood and soil, out of the bodies of men and women who had no voice, and she refused to see it slip from her grasp. Yet her sons were pulling in opposite directions. Thomas and William had grown into men who carried her legacy in their own ways, but where she had once imagined unity, she now saw division that threatened everything. Margaret's evenings were long now. She would sit with her whiskey untouched at her side, her cane resting against the chair, and listen to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the murmur of voices in distant rooms, the faint shuffle of enslaved servants going about their duties. She often summoned her sons, not out of affection but necessity. Thomas would come first, his boots clicking on the polished wood floors, a ledger tucked neatly under his arm. He carried himself with restraint, his expression calm, his tone precise. He would place the ledger on her table and begin reciting figures, the yields of the cotton harvest, the births recorded in the quarters, the debts owed and paid. Numbers flowed from his mouth as though he were less a man than a calculating machine. Margaret admired his discipline, but it unnerved her too. Numbers built wealth, yes, but they did not build power. Power required presence. Power required fear. Then William would arrive, always later than Thomas, his stride restless, his coat often carelessly unbuttoned. He would not bring ledgers or figures, but stories of men disobeying orders, of women who needed correction, of overseers who failed to meet his standards. His voice carried passion, sometimes anger, and always the thirst for control. He was his mother's son, too much so that Margaret would listen to them argue, her thin fingers drumming on the armrest of her chair. Thomas demanded order through calculation. William demanded order through domination. Together they held the plantation in their fists, but their fists were clenched against one another. Thomas's ambitions. Thomas Rowe had begun to look beyond the plantation. The Rowe fortune was secure, the land abundant, the enslaved population large enough to sustain itself for generations. But Thomas saw that power in Georgia was shifting not only in the fields but in the legislature. Men of wealth were turning to politics, securing laws that would protect their interests, expand their holdings, and silence their enemies. In Savannah, in Augusta, in Atlanta, names were rising. Families with fortunes smaller than the Rowes were sending sons into the halls of power, shaping the laws that governed the very trade on which the Rowe empire depended. Thomas could not ignore it. He began traveling more often, attending meetings, dinners, and assemblies. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. His reputation as a man of discipline and calculation made him a trusted voice in matters of finance and trade. Margaret approved of this ambition, at least outwardly. "You will carry our name where it must go," she told him once, her voice heavy with both pride and warning. But in private, she worried. Politics drew attention, and attention drew scrutiny. The Rowe methods thrived in shadow, in silence. Too much light could expose what should remain unseen. William's decline. If Thomas was looking outward, William was sinking deeper inward. He had always been restless, always intoxicated by his authority over the enslaved. But now his behavior had grown darker, more erratic. He stalked the quarters at night, demanding obedience, punishing defiance with a ferocity that even the overseers found excessive. Rumors of his cruelty spread beyond the plantation walls. Neighbors whispered at church gatherings, merchants muttered in taverns, and rival families smirked at the tales. Some dismissed the rumors as exaggeration. Others relished them as signs of Rowe weakness. William seemed not to care. In fact, he thrived on the fear. But Margaret cared. She summoned him one night to her parlor, her voice trembling with both anger and age. "You are reckless," she hissed. "Do you think fear without restraint will keep this house standing? Do you think cruelty without purpose will sustain us?" William only smirked, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Fear is the only thing that keeps them in line," he replied. "Fear, and me." Margaret struck her cane against the floor, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "You are not me," she snapped. "Do not mistake yourself for the hand that built this empire. You are but its keeper, and you may yet be its destroyer." For the first time in years, William faltered, but only for a moment. Whispers of defiance in the quarters. The enslaved felt the shift as keenly as the Rowes themselves. They knew of Margaret's frailty, of Thomas's absences, of William's recklessness. They whispered of it in the dark, their voices low, their eyes glancing toward the shadows for fear of ears that always seemed to be listening. Songs carried meanings now more than ever. A verse hummed while bending over cotton was not merely a melody, it was a message, a signal, a reminder. Children learned from their elders how to disguise resistance in plain sight. A tool broken here, a fire sparked there, a sickness feigned to spare a day's labor. Small acts, but acts all the same. One night, a barn caught fire. Flames licked the sky, devouring the structure in minutes. Thomas investigated with cold precision, William with unbridled fury. Both concluded it was no accident. The enslaved said nothing. Their silence was louder than any confession. For the Rose, the fire was more than destruction of property. It was a warning. Control, once absolute, was beginning to fray. Margaret's furs alone in her room at night. Margaret felt the weight of her legacy pressing down on her chest. She dreamed of chains rattling in the dark, of voices crying out in languages she could not understand. She saw the faces of women she had catalogued like livestock, the faces of children born into bondage by her design. She awoke with sweat on her brow and fear in her heart. The empire she had built was vast, but it was built on sand. She knew it now. Her sons were not united, the enslaved were not subdued, the neighbors were not blind, and she, once the Iron Mistress, was fading. Yet even in her fear her will remained. She refused to see her name undone. Ro, she whispered to herself in the darkness, Ro will endure. But the house she had built was already divided, and division was the first step toward ruin. Chapter 4. The house divided part to the politics of appearances by the spring of 1855. Thomas Roe had grown accustomed to the polished halls of Savannah. He attended meetings in grand parlors lit by chandeliers, where men of wealth and ambition smoked cigars and spoke of tariffs, railroads, and the balance of power between North and South. Thomas did not smile often, but when he did, it was calculated, designed to disarm and invite confidence. He understood that politics was less about truth than about perception. At gatherings, he dressed impeccably, spoke sparingly, and never revealed more than was necessary. He became known as a man of discretion, someone whose counsel was worth seeking. And in this world of maneuvering and ambition, discretion was as valuable as gold. But with influence came scrutiny. Rivals whispered questions. How did the Rose manage such vast lands with so few overseers? How did their cotton always seem to outstrip expectations? Why were there whispers of unrest among their laborers? Thomas deflected such inquiries with ease, yet he knew the danger. What was once concealed in the isolation of the plantation could not remain hidden forever if he intended to bring the Roe name into public life. William's shadow while Thomas pursued reputation in the city. William ruled the plantation with increasing abandon. He drank more heavily, prowled the grounds at all hours, and indulged in cruelties that alarmed even the overseers. He seemed to take pleasure in devising new punishments, and his temper grew unpredictable. One evening he dragged a young man from the quarters into the yard, accusing him of theft. The man pleaded innocence, but William struck him with such violence that even hardened overseers averted their eyes. Margaret, watching from her window, felt something icy crawl through her veins. That night, she summoned William. "You will undo us," she warned, her voice brittle but sharp. "The world is watching. William, do you not understand? If word of your excesses reaches the wrong ears, we will not face whispers. We will face inquiry." William leaned against the mantel, his expression defiant. "Let them come," he said. "No one dares touch the Rose. Not here. Not now." But Margaret saw in his eyes a madness she could not control. He was not defending the family, he was destroying it. One reckless act at a time. The overseer's dilemma. Samuel Carter, the plantation's head overseer, had served the Rose for nearly 2 decades. He was a man hardened by years in the fields, his authority unquestioned among the enslaved and respected even by the Rose themselves. But in William's dissent, Carter saw danger not only for the family but for himself. Late one evening Carter met with Thomas in the study. The fire crackled between them as Carter spoke. "Mr. Thomas," he began carefully, "your brother, he pushes too far. The people are restless. A fire does not start itself, and neither will the next." Thomas listened, his hands folded. "What would you have me do? Rein him in, or send him away? If not, I fear we'll face more than broken tools and burned barns. They'll rise, and when they do, they won't stop until this house falls." Thomas's gaze did not waver. "My brother is not to be removed," he said coldly. "But I hear you, Carter. Keep order. That is your task. Leave William to me." But in his heart, Thomas knew William was beyond his control. The gathering storming the quarters, the enslaved prepared in ways unseen by the Rose. Families whispered by the dying firelight. Older men spoke in riddles to the younger ones, teaching them patience and caution. Mothers sang lullabies to their children that were, in truth, maps of escape routes, rivers to follow, stars to guide by. Among them, a woman named Ruth emerged as a quiet leader. She had seen too many children sold, too many friends buried, too many nights of cruelty under William's hand. Ruth did not raise her voice, but when she spoke, others listened. "It won't last," she said one night, her words barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "The Rose fight among themselves. They ain't looking at us. That's when we move. That's when we take what's ours. Some argued for patience, others for boldness, but all agreed the fire had been only the beginning. Margaret's isolation, Margaret's health waned. She found herself confined to her chamber more often, the once indomitable mistress now frail and bent. Yet her will did not soften. She summoned Thomas and William separately, no longer trusting their presence together. To Thomas she said, "The name must endure. You are its shield. Do not let politics blind you to the danger at home." To William she said, "You are my blood, but you are not my heir. If you do not master yourself, you will be cast aside even by me." William left her chamber in silence that night, his face pale with rage. For the first time, he wondered if his mother might strip him of inheritance, leaving him with nothing but his cruelty. Margaret, alone after his departure, felt a cold certainty settle over her. The empire she had built was cracking from within, and no amount of iron will could bind it forever. The turning point of summer brought drought. The cotton withered in the fields, and tempers flared under the relentless sun. Work slowed, output dwindled, and punishment increased. One sweltering night, another fire broke out, this time in the cotton gin. The blaze roared higher than the first, its glow visible for miles. Thomas rushed back from Savannah, his face grim as he surveyed the smoldering ruin. William raged like a madman, vowing retribution, while Carter stood silently by, his jaw clenched. Margaret, watching from the veranda, knew what the fire meant. It was no accident, no isolated act. It was defiance. It was rebellion simmering beneath the surface. "The house is divided," she whispered to herself, clutching her cane so tightly her knuckles whitened. "And a house divided cannot stand." But though she spoke the words, she could not bring herself to believe them, not yet. Not while she still drew breath. Chapter 5, The Fall of the Rose. The mistress's last breath. On 1856, the trees along the plantation road burned with color, scarlet and gold against the pale sky. Within the great house, Margaret Rowe lay in her chamber, breath shallow, eyes dulled with fever. Once she had been the iron will that bound the Rowe empire together. Now she was but a husk, skin stretched thin, hands trembling as she gripped her rosary beads. The doctor from Savannah visited, shook his head, and whispered words of resignation. "She has not long," he told Thomas at the door. "Perhaps days, perhaps only hours." Thomas stood silent, jaw clenched. He had expected this moment, prepared for it in the cold ledger of his mind. But as he looked upon his mother's frail form, he felt something unfamiliar stir, something dangerously close to grief. William, on the other hand, prowled the corridors like a restless animal. He refused to enter Margaret's chamber, muttering that she still watched him, still judged him even in her weakness. Yet in truth, he feared the moment she passed, for with her death the last restraint upon him would be gone. The Wilter nights later, Margaret Rowe exhaled her final breath. A storm raged outside as though the heavens themselves marked her passing. The house fell into silence, save for the relentless patter of rain against the windows. When the lawyer arrived days later to read her will, the air in the parlor was thick with tension. Thomas sat composed, William restless, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. The will was precise, its language sharp as the woman herself. The estate, lands, and fortune were divided unequally. Thomas received the lion's share, with specific instructions to maintain the plantation with discipline and foresight. William was granted a smaller portion, money, livestock, and a parcel of land far from the main estate. But it was her final clause that drew the heir from the room. Should either son act in a manner that imperils the family's legacy, his share is forfeit to the other. William's face blanched, then flushed crimson. He rose, fists clenched. "She sought to strip me even in death," he thundered. Thomas said nothing, but inwardly he acknowledged the truth. Their mother had foreseen the rift, and she had sought to control it even from the grave. A family at Walther Plantation mourned Margaret with formalities, but beneath the surface, the enslaved whispered of new possibilities. The mistress was gone. The one who had orchestrated every cruelty with cold calculation could no longer tighten her grip. Her sons, divided, might not hold as firm. Thomas threw himself into work, doubling his efforts to stabilize the plantation and preserve his growing political career. He corresponded with legislators, negotiated new trade agreements, and sought to quiet rumors of unrest that had begun to ripple through Georgia. William, however, spiraled. He drank more, lashed out at the overseers, and descended into acts of violence that shocked even those who had long endured him. He ordered brutal punishments for the slightest infractions, prowled the quarters at night, and seemed determined to prove that he, not Thomas, commanded the estate. The house became a battlefield. Brothers exchanged words laced with venom. Servants avoided the corridors when both were present. The grand plantation, once ruled by a singular will, now groaned under the weight of discord. Rumors and rebellion. The quarters. Ruth's voice grew stronger. She told the people that Margaret's death was a sign that the rows were crumbling. Their house is built on us, she whispered, and when it falls because we push. Small acts of resistance multiplied, tools misplaced, fences cut, livestock let loose at night. William responded with rage, Thomas with frustration, but the more they pressed, the more the spirit of defiance burned. One night Ruth spoke beneath the stars to a gathering of dozens. We've waited long enough. They are weaker than ever. If we rise now, we rise together. No more children sold, no more whips, no more chains. Her words ignited a flame that no overseer's lash could quench. Foreshadowing the end by winter. The plantation stood on the edge of chaos. Thomas balanced precariously between public ambition and private disaster. William spiraled deeper into violence, consumed by a need to dominate what he could not control. And in the shadows of the quarters, the enslaved prepared not for survival alone, but for freedom. The Row legacy, built on blood and silence, trembled on the brink of collapse, and the storm that would sweep it all away had only begun to gather. Chapter 5. The fall of the rosecracks in the facade. The months after Margaret Rowe's death exposed fissures that could no longer be hidden. The plantation's facade of order, its neat fields, its grand columns, its illusion of permanence began to crumble. Thomas fought to maintain appearances. He attended town meetings, gave measured speeches on Southern prosperity, and cultivated allies among merchants and politicians. Yet behind closed doors, letters arrived almost weekly with troubling news. Cotton yields down, shipments delayed, whispers of defiance among the enslaved. He reassured his partners, but his nights were restless. In ledgers once marked with steady profit, the ink now told a different story. Losses creeping upward, debts looming. His brother's recklessness cost more than dignity. It bled the plantation dry. William no longer masked his appetites. Where once he had hidden his cruelties in shadow, now he acted openly, daring anyone to oppose him. Overseers watched with unease as he stalked the quarters, his lantern swinging wildly in the dark. He took what he wished: food, drink, bodies leaving ruin in his wake. One winter night, in a fit of drunken rage, he struck an overseer who dared question him. The man left the estate the next morning, muttering that no coin was worth his life. William saw betrayal everywhere. He accused the enslaved of plotting theft, of hiding tools, of plotting rebellion. Each accusation led to punishment. Each punishment fed the whispers in the quarters. He is losing himself. He is not untouchable. And as William unraveled, Ruth's quiet movement grew stronger. Ruth's plan. Ruth had long known fear, but fear had hardened into resolve. With Margaret gone and William unhinged, she sensed a moment opening like a door. By firelight, she gathered trusted souls. Jacob, strong and silent, who had once been a blacksmith. Anna, whose children had been sold south but who still carried fire in her eyes. And others, weary yet unbroken. We rise not with anger alone, Ruth told them. We rise with purpose. If we strike blindly, we will be crushed. But if we strike when their eyes are elsewhere, when they are divided, then we might see freedom. They began to plan. Messages passed in song and prayer, tools hidden for the night to come. They did not yet know the day, but they knew it would come. The brothers confronted one evening. Thomas returned from Savannah to find William drunk in the parlor, papers strewn across the floor. The documents were Thomas's letters of credit, contracts, political correspondences. You think you can cut me out? William slurred, eyes bloodshot. Mother gave you the land, the wealth, the power, but I am a Rowe too. This house is mine as much as yours. Thomas's voice was low, cold as steel. You shame this house. You shame her memory. If you cannot master yourself, you will lose everything. William staggered forward, fists clenched. You think you're better than me, hiding behind numbers, hiding behind words in fine halls. You don't know power, Thomas. I do. Power is what bleeds when you cut it. Power is what cries when you own it. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Thomas did not strike his brother, but in that moment he understood. William was no longer an ally. He was a threat. The overseer's choice, Samuel Carter, remained, though others had fled. Loyalty bound him, but even he wavered. He saw the brothers' war, the mistress's absence, the restless stirrings among the enslaved. He knew the balance could not last. One night he met Ruth by chance at the edge of the fields. Their eyes met hers fierce, his weary. He said nothing, but in that silence Ruth understood. He would not stand in her way. Perhaps, in some hidden part of him, he even wished her success. The spark came sooner than Ruth had planned. One cold dawn, William stormed into the quarters, accusing Jacob of theft. No evidence, no witnesses, only William's rage. He ordered Jacob bound, flogged before all. As the whip cracked, something broke not in Jacob, but in the crowd. Murmurs turned to shouts, shouts to cries. Hands grasped stones, tools, anything that could strike back. William staggered, startled, as a stone split his cheek. He screamed for the overseers, but only Carter hesitated at the edge of the mob, his face grim. Ruth's voice rose above the chaos. Now, and with that word, years of silence gave way to fury. The night of fire. By nightfall, the plantation was ablaze. The quarters erupted first, flames licking at the wooden walls, smoke curling into the sky. William raged, pistol in hand, firing blindly into the crowd until he was dragged down. Thomas returned from Savannah, too late, his carriage meeting fleeing overseers on the road. The sky glowed red behind them, the sound of screams and gunfire echoing across the fields. When Thomas crested the hill, he saw the Rowe estate, his empire, his inheritance consumed by fire. The great house stood silhouetted against the inferno, its pillars blackened, its windows glowing like the eyes of some dying beast. Ruth stood among her people, face lit by the flames. She did not run, she did not bow. She had waited too long for this night, the beginning of the end. The Rowe brothers' legacy, decades of cruelty, generations of wealth built on chains, collapsed in hours. The land that had borne witness to so much suffering now bore witness to its reckoning. Thomas felt the weight of it in his chest. His mother's empire, his own ambition, his brother's madness, all turned to Ashdod, and in that fire, the enslaved who had once been silenced found their voices.